I started doing comedy at medical school, but you can imagine what that was like. Medical school reviews also always have terrible pun names like Back Passage to India or On Her Majesty's Secret Cervix. And they tend to be fairly scatological and actually not terribly funny, but when you tell them in front of an in-house audience at medical school, everybody roars with laughter and you think you're the funniest thing in the world. And then you go to the Edinburgh Fringe, and that's where just about anyone who's made it in comedy, it's their stomping ground. You do a 3-week run at the Edinburgh Fringe, and then you find if you're funny or not, because you perform in front of the public, in some little black sweaty box somewhere, and critics. And that's where you learn your trade, and I think that's where I realised I could do it, but it's a fairly tough apprenticeship. Doctors often have a huge amount of confidence, but not necessarily the competence to go with it, and it's a craft like anything else. You learn it, and I would say the Edinburgh Fringe is how I realised I could do comedy. I think actually there's quite a strong history of comedy and medicine. If you look at people like Graham Garden in The Goodies, Graham Chapman in Monty Python, Harry Hill, and my former comedy partner Tony Gardner. I formed this junior doctor double act called Struck Off and Die with Tony back in 1990. We were angry junior doctors, and then he gave up medicine and starred in My Parents Are Aliens and Fresh Meat and Last Tango in Halifax. So I think there's a long history actually of doctors who've done comedy. I would also say I think medicine is in part a performing art. You're performing to if a patient doesn't feel better for coming to see you, then you're probably in the wrong game. So I think there is an element of performance in medicine, and I think the two run side by side. I always say I often just communicate for a living. I listen and I speak, and if you can earn a living like that, it's not bad. I think comedy is a very good way of delivering a message. I think satire particularly is a very good way at crystallising an argument, but it doesn't always offer a solution. You can be sarcastic, you can be ironic, you can try to hold people to account satirically, but ultimately if you want to make the health service better, you've got to try and offer some solutions as well. So I think comedy only goes so far, and people who think, comedy can be a medium for changing things, I think they're probably a little bit inflated. I think occasionally it can. I would say the American comedian Tina Fey doing a parody of Sarah Palin is one example of a political career being destroyed by comedy. Unfortunately, you can't do the same for Donald Trump. He's almost impossible to parody. So I think comedy, yes, does get a message across. It highlights problems, but it doesn't necessarily offer solutions. But I think it's good. I've always done what I call comedy with a message. So I like people to laugh, but I like people to think as well. But the trick is not to make it sound preachy. People don't want to be preached to. Ultimately, with a comedian, your job is to make people laugh. But if they can think as well, then they go, well, yeah, I sort of got a bit more. Because some comedy is a bit like a takeaway meal, isn't it? You go and it's like having a take, and you've forgotten what you've eaten 10 minutes later. I like people to remember what they've heard. I think humour is very useful and actually a very powerful way of communicating with people. But it's interesting because the consultations are very intimate. It's a one-on-one thing. But actually after dinner speaking is also quite intimate. You have to get to know your audience. So when I do after dinner speaking, I always sit with the audience first to get to know them. And likewise in a medical consultation, you've got to get to know a patient and their relatives and carers to see whether comedy is appropriate. And you judge, the mood of the room, and usually I can make patients laugh. And I'm not there to tell jokes as a doctor, but generally, you can cheer them up and make them feel offer them hope, I think, is the most important thing. Some comedy can be quite cruel and destructive, and some can be constructive and hopeful, and that's what I try to do in a consultation. I've only once fallen on my face when I was a young doctor. I can't remember what I said. I think it was a joke about somebody's hemorrhoids looking like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and this chap said that the consultation room was no place for a joke, sonny, or something, and I realised I'd overstepped the mark. But you learn from your mistakes. That's important in any career. I think it's quite seductive being on stage. You suddenly, if you're successful, you suddenly get loads of people laughing at you, and it can go to your head a bit, and some people enjoy that, but I find it a bit lovey. So if I do too much comedy, I just find it's almost artificial. And I like being grounded. And actually, I like the day job as a doctor. I think it's particularly important as a man to sit down and try and be empathic and to help people. Because, we're very self-interested. We can, go our own way and promote our own careers. But actually, the beauty of medicine and the beauty of the consultation is actually you're using everything in your power to help someone and to be empathic. And everyone needs to do that a bit. So if I wasn't doing medicine, if I'd given up that and just done comedy, I'd hopefully do some charity work. But I enjoy being a doctor. I found it an honour, but I would say I couldn't do it full time. I take my hat off to anyone who works full time in the NHS. because it's really, really hard at the moment. So I do it, but I do it part-time. The NHS is, I think, our most important institution in that it glues us together as a compassionate society. So we go back to 1948 when it was founded. This idea of treating people according to need, the idea that we pool all our money and then people are treated according to their needs. So as Nye Bevan said, that the hallmark of a civilized society is that, we look after those most in need. And I think that just still endures, that ethos still endures. That's really important. I think the NHS is under pressure now partly because it's a victim of its own success. When it was founded in 1948, half of us died before the age of 65. Now 1 in 3 people live to 100. Some people reckon the person who lives to 150 has already been born. I don't think it's you, by the way. Don't be too disappointed. But the point is, demand for services is growing by about 4 to 6% year on year because we're living longer with diseases that previously would have killed us. At the moment, we will have had about 10 years of flatline funding. So continuous growth in demand, 10 years of flatline funding. Now, if you think of that in terms of your industry, how would you cope with that? Well, I think we're struggling now with the notion of universal healthcare, the fact that the NHS can provide everything for everyone for the money we're putting in, I don't think is sustainable. But I think the argument needs to be had with the public. The public who pay for the NHS need to decide how much money they want to put into the NHS, whether they want it to be entirely tax funded, whether they want to pay private insurance or top-up fees, whether they're happy for NHS providers to be state providers or private providers. All these debates are happening now, and actually I strongly believe it's a public service and the public should have a voice in that. And I think the way it's changed, I guess, is that the centre has become more controlling and they're making lots of big decisions now. They promise no decision about me without me, but they just carry on doing this, and I think the public are left behind, haven't really got a clue what's going on. I never planned a career in the media. A lot of my comedy career has been winging it, I guess. When I first went to Edinburgh in 1990, I was a junior doctor activist. And although junior doctors always seem to be complaining about something, back then we were working 120 hours a week. I had friends who'd fallen asleep at the wheel, fallen asleep in the wound. Some people got depressed and suicidal because of their working conditions. So it was almost like a quite political comedy in the early days, and very unusual. It was quite brave for junior doctors to have done that sort of thing. And so we got picked up by the BBC from Edinburgh and then offered series on Radio 4. And I was at the BBC Light Entertainment Christmas party, and I spotted Ian Hislop, who was the fairly recent editor of Private Eye. And I'd always been a reader of Private Eye, and I followed him into the toilet. And I said, Ian, can I have a column in Private Eye? And he said, would you mind not standing so close to me? But in fact, he gave me a column called, it was then called Doing the Rounds. And that's when I started doing the whistleblowing stuff in the media as well. So I've worked for the NHS for over 30 years, but I've written for Private Eye for 24 years. And then presented Trust Me, I'm a Doctor on the back of that, which was a BBC series in the mid-90s. I was the first presenter of that. So I've been working for the BBC pretty much for 20-odd years. But it's all on health-related issues. So the material is similar, whether I'm doing comedy or whether I'm doing straight or whether I'm doing broadcasting. I just change the timing slightly. There's always a danger when you're a doctor performing, because you are always a doctor, and the General Medical Council is quite strict about this. And as you get older, your audience tends to get older. It's not unusual for people to collapse during my shows, and I then have to get down on stage and attempt to resuscitate them or ask them what they're doing. And one of my most embarrassing ones, I did something for Radio 4 actually, and for some reason they decided to give people a drink on the way in. I think someone had a few too many. So this is halfway through a Radio 4 recording, somebody collapses, and I have to stop the recording and get down from the stage. Foolishly, when I did Dr Phil's Rude Health tour, I invited people to bring their ailments along, and this person brought a urine specimen along. She thought she had an infection, it was stinging a bit, didn't have time to go and see a GP. And I actually had my black bag with me, so I had some sticks in there, and I managed to test it, and it was highly likely she had a urine infection. And then there was a GP in the audience who'd brought his prescription pad. So I passed it on to him. He prescribed some antibiotics, and she left the show with some antibiotics. It's very rare you go for a night of comedy and you leave with antibiotics, but it has happened. I might be struck off for that, but who cares? It's a good story. Connection is really, well, here's an interesting thing. This is how I connect with people. Actually, this is the most important prop that I have. Most people of a certain age who grew up in this country remember the Clangers. These were the first ever children's colour TV programme. Oliver Postgate, who gave us back Puss and other things, he was an old-style pacifist socialist green, and he was asked to come up with a colour TV programme. He came up with the Clangers, who were a population of mauve mice who lived on a planet. They had free soup for all. It was like socialist propaganda. There was no need for politics or money because everyone got the soup they needed. There was blue string pudding. But Clangers is actually what I use as an acronym for all the things you need to be healthy and happy. And the C of Clangers is connect. So Clangers rather spookily stands for connect, learn, be active, notice, give back, eat well, relax, sleep. If you do your daily Clangers, you're really happy. But connection is by far the most important of those things, because human beings are social animals. We exist to feel that we're leaves on a tree, that we belong to something bigger, and you have to connect with your audience. And probably the best way of connecting is to be self-deprecating, to tell jokes against yourself, to talk about mistakes that you've made, your problems as a junior doctor, problems in your own family. That generally is universal, because people see once you're laughing at yourself, then that invites them to make those connections. So rather than just taking the mickey about other people, the secret if you take the mickey out of other people is to do them higher up the tree than you are. There's no point in me making jokes about patients, particularly because they're lower down the pecking order. So I think provided you're self-deprecating and then your targets are higher up the tree than you are, then I think that generally connects with an audience. And what's also is I think most of the problems we face are fairly universal: work-life balance, how to be as well as to do. We're obsessed with achieving in our lives, and we never sit down and actually enjoy the world around us. I think there are things that, when you do comedy with a message, you give space for people to reflect on what you're saying as well, and that usually connects. Yeah, I often get asked to do serious stuff as well, so I've chaired a lot of health conferences, as you'd imagine, but some non-health conferences, and often they will book you in the combination of serious, interactive facilitation during the day, and then they'll get you to do a comedy speech in the evening. And that often works quite well because the audience has got to know you, and then cleverly you can bring themes from the day in and make them funny in the evening. I think it's important when you're doing conference facilitation that you're not a Jeremy Paxman. You're not there to interrogate people, you're there to get the best out of them. And I really enjoy facilitating conferences. I really enjoy audience interaction and getting the audience involved. That's one of the strengths of using a stand-up comedian who's used to handling an audience is that they can get audience engagement, which people often struggle with. And we often use all sorts of electronic devices and pressing things, but actually face-to-face questioning. So I think you have to be sincere, and you mustn't undermine the motives of the conference. But then when the conference is over, you switch into comedy mode and you can lightly subvert one or two of the things you've seen during the day. I've spoken to, thousands of audiences. I guess I've done this first since 1990, so I've been doing it for 26 years, and I've spoken to just about every audience you could imagine, from funeral directors to women's institutes to banking executives to politicians to patients. I think health is universal. What keeps you happy? How can you get the most out of your one wild and precious life is a pretty universal theme that everyone is interested in. I think people are interested in their health even if they neglect it. So I haven't yet found an audience where health, mental health, depression, death, you think they sound full of dark themes, but I can assure you there are ways of making them funny and engaging, because we're all leaves on that tree, and I think those universal themes apply to everyone. And it's interesting how similar we are. You would think the Women's Institute and banking executives would be a different audience, but they often laugh at pretty much the same things.